The Onyx Room did not exist on the same plane as other restaurants. It was a pocket dimension carved out of the heart of Manhattan, a place where the air itself seemed to be filtered through wealth and power. The scent was a complex blend of old money, aged leather, and the subtle, earthy perfume of truffles being shaved over dishes that cost more than a month's rent. Light did not simply illuminate the space. It dripped from enormous crystal chandeliers like frozen constellations, casting long, dramatic shadows across tables spaced so far apart that entire corporate mergers could be whispered into existence without fear of being overheard. The soundscape was a carefully curated symphony of hushed tones, the gentle clinking of silver cutlery against porcelain, and the distant, almost imperceptible pop of a vintage champagne cork. This was not a place for nourishment. It was a theater of influence, a golden sanctuary where the titans of industry and finance came not merely to dine, but to assert their dominance over the world, one astronomically expensive bite at a time. Every surface, from the polished obsidian floors to the dark mahogany walls, was designed to reflect a distorted, more powerful version of its patrons, a constant reminder that here, they were kings. Moving through this gilded ecosystem was Elara Vance, a ghost in a crisp, black uniform. Her movements were a study in efficiency, a silent ballet of practiced precision that allowed her to remain utterly invisible to the clientele she served. She refilled water glasses with a wrist that never trembled, cleared plates with a grace that left no sound, and maintained a serene, neutral expression that was as much a part of her uniform as the starched apron tied around her waist. But beneath this placid surface, a different reality churned. Her heart beat not with the calm rhythm of a seasoned waitress, but with the frantic, desperate cadence of a woman running a race against time. Every step on the plush carpet sent a dull ache through her feet, a physical manifestation of the double shifts and the endless hours. Her mind was a constant ledger of expenses, her brother's physical therapy, the specialized medications, the looming cost of the next neurological consultation. She saw the patrons not as people, but as numbers, calculating in a split second how a generous tip on a four-figure bill could translate into another week of essential care, another small comfort for the boy whose life had been fractured. The quiet opulence of the Onyx Room was a constant, bitter irony. The hushed reverence of the space was a world away from the sounds that filled her small apartment. The hum of medical equipment, the strained, effortful breaths of her younger brother, and the silence that followed when his pain became too much for words. Elara had once inhabited a world of academia, a bright, promising doctoral candidate in developmental psychology and art therapy. Her dissertation was set to be groundbreaking, a new methodology for connecting with neurodivergent children, but that world had vanished in a single, catastrophic moment. A pediatric medical device, rushed to market by a faceless corporation named Finch Global, had malfunctioned, leaving her brother with a severe neurological injury. The brilliant future she had envisioned was replaced by a brutal present of caregiving, legal battles that drained her family's savings, and a settlement that was little more than an insult. Now, her profound understanding of the human mind, her once celebrated academic genius, was relegated to anticipating whether a diner preferred sparkling or still water, a secret skill hidden behind the veneer of service. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The subtle shift in the room's atmosphere was a language Elara had learned to read fluently. It was a change that preceded the arrival of true power, a ripple of anxiety that spread through the staff long before the cause was visible. Then, he entered. Alistair Finch did not walk into the Onyx Room. He took possession of it. The maitre d', a man who regularly greeted senators and foreign dignitaries with unflappable poise, seemed to shrink by several inches in his presence. Alistair dismissed him with a curt, dismissive wave of his hand, his eyes already scanning the room as if appraising assets. He was dressed in a bespoke suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light, tailored with a precision that bespoke immense expense and an even greater ego. His gaze was cold, analytical, sweeping over the other patrons with a faint, barely concealed contempt. Trailing in his formidable wake was a small boy, Leo, whose hand was lost in his father's grip. The boy's eyes were wide, darting around the cavernous, dimly lit space, taking in the overwhelming sensory input with a visible tension that Alistair either didn't notice or chose to ignore. The dinner was a performance, and Alistair Finch was its sole director. He was meeting with a potential investor, a man whose placid expression betrayed nothing of the high-stakes negotiation unfolding over plates of seared scallops and Wagyu beef. Alistair's voice was a low, confident hum, peppering his speech with financial jargon and market projections. He gestured with his hands, carving up the air as if dividing continents and economies for his personal gain. From her vantage point, Ilara watched the scene with a detached professionalism, but her attention was drawn to the boy. She saw what the billionaire father could not. She saw the way Leo's small shoulders were hunched up to his ears, a desperate attempt to make himself smaller. She saw his fingers subtly plugging and unplugging his ears, trying to modulate the overwhelming sound of the room. She saw the slight, rhythmic rocking of his body in the large leather chair, a self-soothing mechanism that Alistair repeatedly tried to quell with a sharp, icy glare and a hissed whisper that was far more violent than any shout. The breaking point arrived with the suddenness of a lightning strike. A table across the room erupted in a moment of boisterous laughter, a sound that, in the tomb-like quiet of the onyx room, was as jarring as a gunshot. For Leo, it was the final assault on his overloaded senses. The quiet rocking escalated into frantic movement, and a low hum of distress escaped his lips, quickly spiraling into a high-pitched wail of pure, unadulterated anguish. It was not the cry of a spoiled child having a tantrum. It was the raw, desperate sound of a nervous system in meltdown, a soul crying out from a prison of sensory overload. The entire restaurant froze. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died in an instant. Every eye in the room turned toward Alistair Finch's table, where the carefully constructed illusion of his absolute control was being shattered by the unfiltered pain of his own son. For Alistair, the sound was not a plea for help. It was an act of public treason. It was a flaw in his legacy, a crack in the perfect facade of power he projected to the world. His face, which moments before had been a mask of corporate charm, hardened into a canvas of cold, unbridled fury. Embarrassment, hot and sharp, coursed through his veins. He leaned in close to his son, his voice a venomous whisper. He didn't offer comfort, he issued commands. "Stop it. Be quiet. You are embarrassing me." He grabbed Leo's arm, his grip far too tight, attempting to physically restrain the meltdown as if it were a hostile takeover to be quashed through brute force. But his power, the force that bent markets and crushed competitors, was utterly useless here. Every harsh word, every menacing gesture only amplified the boy's terror, feeding the fire of his panic until his cries echoed off the marble floors, a testament to his father's profound and catastrophic failure. From across the room, Ilara watched, and the professional mask she wore so carefully began to crack. She was not seeing a billionaire and his unruly child. She was seeing a textbook case of sensory overload being tragically mismanaged by ignorance and ego. The boy's panicked shrieks were a language she understood perfectly, a dialect of pain she had learned through years of study and then mastered in the crucible of her own family's tragedy. In Leo's wide, terrified eyes, she saw her brother. She felt a familiar, cold fury solidify in her stomach. Not at the child, but at the father, at this powerful man who was so blinded by his own reflection that he couldn't see the real suffering in front of him. A profound sense of duty, the core of her being that had been dormant for so long, began to stir. The waitress was receding, and the therapist, the protector, the woman who knew exactly what that little boy needed, was about to step forward. Ignoring protocol, ignoring the silent, screaming warnings from the restaurant manager, ignoring every instinct for self-preservation that told her to remain a shadow, Alara began to move. It was not a conscious decision, not a choice weighed with pros and cons, but an undeniable gravitational pull, a deep cellular command that overrode everything else. The professional veneer, so carefully maintained for years, dissolved like smoke, and in its place was the woman she had been forced to bury, the academic, the healer, the sister who had spent countless nights on a hospital floor, learning the silent language of profound distress. Every wail from the small boy at Alistair Finch's table was a phantom echo of her own brother's suffering, a sound that resonated in the hollows of her memory. A cold, clarifying fury settled in her veins, not the hot, reckless kind, but a focused, glacial resolve. It was a fury directed not at the child, but at the world, that allowed such powerful men to be so profoundly ignorant of the delicate souls in their care. The job, the tips, the crushing weight of her financial reality, it all faded into a distant hum. All that mattered was the small, terrified boy drowning in a sea of sensory chaos. Her first step from the periphery of the room was a declaration of war against the established order of this gilded sanctuary. It was a transgression so profound that the air itself seemed to grow thicker, heavier with unspoken judgment. The maître des eyes widened in sheer horror, a silent plea for her to stop, to retreat back into the invisibility she was paid to maintain. Other staff members froze in their tracks, trays of expensive cocktails held aloft like statues, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. The hushed symphony of the restaurant faltered, the clinking of cutlery slowing as patrons turned their heads, their curiosity piqued by this sudden, inexplicable break in the flawless choreography of service. Alara felt their stares like physical pressure, 100 pairs of eyes tracking the impossible journey of a simple waitress, daring to approach the table of a titan. She kept her own eyes fixed forward, locked on the small, trembling form of the boy, creating a tunnel of purpose through the cavern of wealth and influence. She was no longer a servant. She was on a rescue mission. As she drew closer, the full force of Alistair Finch's aura washed over her. It was a palpable thing, a field of cold, intimidating energy that radiated from him like the chill from a block of ice. He was still leaning over his son, his words now a low, menacing hiss, each syllable a tiny, sharp weapon designed to force compliance. He did not notice her at first, so consumed was he by his own rage and embarrassment, so utterly convinced of his own centrality that the approach of a mere waitress was beneath his perception. This blindness, she knew, was the source of his power and his greatest weakness. He saw the world through a lens of hierarchy and value, and she, in her simple black uniform, registered as nothing. She was furniture, a part of the scenery, and this fundamental miscalculation gave her the opening she needed. She didn't hesitate, didn't pause to ask permission. She simply walked past the glowering billionaire as if he weren't there, a deliberate act of negation that was, in its own quiet way, the most profound insult she could have delivered. She did not address the father. She did not speak a single word. Instead, in a movement of profound and startling grace, Alara lowered herself to the floor, her knees meeting the plush, expensive carpet without a sound. She sat, not at the table, but beside it, placing herself on the same level as the distraught child. The simple act of lowering herself was a radical rebalancing of power in the room. It was an act of humility, of service, not to the billionaire who paid the bills, but to the small, suffering soul who had no currency here. From this new vantage point, on the floor of the Onyx room, the world looked different. The towering tables, the distant chandeliers, the judgmental faces of the diners, they all seemed part of a strange, alien landscape. Here, on the floor, the only thing that was real was the boy's pain. She could feel the vibrations of his frantic movements through the carpet, see the tears tracking paths through the sweat on his temples, and hear the raw, ragged quality of his breathing between sobs. She was in his world now. From the pocket of her apron, she retrieved a simple, black ink pen, a tool of her trade used for taking orders and tallying bills. She smoothed a clean, white linen napkin onto the floor in front of her. The crisp fabric, a stark contrast to the dark, swirling pattern of the carpet. The entire restaurant was now a vacuum of suspended animation. The silence was absolute, broken only by Leo's ragged, hitching sobs. Every patron, every staff member, was transfixed by the quiet, inexplicable drama unfolding on the floor. With a steady hand, Alara touched the tip of the pen to the napkin. She didn't draw a picture, not a house or a flower or a smiling face. She drew a line. A single, straight line. Then another, parallel to the first. She began to draw a simple, repetitive pattern of interlocking squares. A grid that was predictable, orderly, and calm. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Each stroke of the pen a silent, rhythmic mantra. There was no emotion on her face, only a deep, unwavering focus. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Leo's wails, which had been echoing through the cavernous room, began to subside. His frantic, whole-body rocking lessened, and his head, which had been buried in his arms, slowly lifted. His tear-filled eyes, wide with panic and confusion, found the moving tip of the pen. He watched, his breathing still hitched and uneven, as the grid on the napkin grew, square by methodical square. It was a visual anchor in a storm of overwhelming sensory input. The pattern was logical. It was quiet. It made sense in a world that, just moments before, had been a terrifying whirlwind of noise and light and pressure. The screams softened into whimpers. The whimpers into shuddering breaths. He was mesmerized, his entire being zeroing in on the small, safe world being created on the piece of white linen. The chaos in his mind began to recede, pushed back by the silent, steady rhythm of the drawing. Alara continued the pattern for another full minute, giving him time, allowing the silence and the rhythm to do their work. She did not look at him directly, knowing that eye contact could be perceived as a demand, another layer of pressure. She simply continued to build the grid, offering a silent language of stability. Then, with the same slow, deliberate grace, she gently pushed the napkin and the pen across the small space of carpet that separated them. It was not a command, but an invitation, an offering, a question asked without words. She placed the pen beside the napkin and then rested her hands, palms up, on her own knees, a gesture of absolute non-aggression. She had built a bridge. It was up to him if he wanted to cross it. The entire room held its breath, witnesses to a moment of communication more delicate and powerful than any negotiation that had ever taken place within these walls. For a long moment, Leo simply stared at the pen and paper. His small chest rose and fell with the aftershocks of his meltdown. Then, with a hand that trembled visibly, he reached out. His fingers, small and clumsy with residual stress, fumbled with the pen before closing around it. He picked it up, his grip tight. He looked from the pen to the grid on the napkin, his brow furrowed in concentration. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the white space. Then, he lowered the tip of the pen to the napkin. He didn't add to the grid, he drew a circle. A shaky, imperfect circle, right in the middle of one of her squares. Then, he drew another, inside the first, and another. He was creating his own pattern, a concentric, inward spiraling shape that was his answer to her structured grid. The last of his sobs died in his throat, replaced by the faint scratching sound of the pen on the linen. He was no longer crying. He was drawing. The silence that followed was of a different quality now. It was no longer the tense, horrified silence of a public spectacle. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated awe. The investor across the table from Alistair stared, his mouth slightly agape, the multi-million-dollar deal they had been discussing completely forgotten. Diners exchanged glances of disbelief. The maître d', looked as though he had just witnessed a miracle, his professional mask of unflappable calm completely shattered. In a room built on the foundations of money and intimidation, a waitress with a napkin and a pen had wielded a power that no one there could comprehend. She had not commanded or threatened or bribed. She had connected. She had met a child in his moment of greatest need and offered him not a solution, but a shared language, a silent space where he could feel safe. But for Alistair Finch, this was not a miracle. It was the ultimate humiliation. He stood over them, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the scene on the floor. His face, which had been a mask of fury, was now something far colder, far more dangerous. It was a mask of absolute reptilian stillness. This woman, this nobody, this server, had succeeded where he, with all his power and intellect, had catastrophically failed. She had not only calmed his son, but she had done so by pointedly and completely ignoring him, rendering him irrelevant in his own family drama. She had exposed his impotence in front of a crucial business partner, revealing the one asset he could not control. Her act of compassion was not, in his eyes, a kindness. It was a judgment. It was a public declaration that he was a failure as a father, a truth he could not bear to confront. A narcissistic rage, cold and pure, surged through him, demanding an immediate and brutal reassertion of his dominance. He did not raise his voice. The truly powerful never had to. He simply made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand, summoning the terrified restaurant manager to his side. The manager scurried over, his face pale, already anticipating the storm that was about to break. Alistair leaned in, his voice a low, venomous whisper, meant only for the manager but laced with a menace that seemed to drop the temperature of the air around them. He didn't look at Alara, still sitting on the floor, her focus entirely on the now calm child. He spoke as if she were an object, a piece of faulty equipment to be removed. "I don't know who she is," he breathed, his words precise and sharp as shards of glass. "But I want her gone, not at the end of her shift, not in an hour. I want her out of my sight, now." It was not a request, it was an executive order, delivered with the casual tyranny of a man who had never been told no. The manager's face crumpled. He looked from the terrifyingly calm face of Alistair Finch to the scene on the floor, the quiet boy, the gentle waitress. He was trapped between a basic human decency and the terrifying economic reality of who stood before him. But there was no choice, not really. Alistair Finch was not just a patron, he was an institution. His displeasure could ruin a place like this. With a look of profound regret, the manager approached Alara. He cleared his throat, his own voice barely a whisper. "Miss," he began, his tone apologetic, "could you please come with me?" Alara looked up, her gaze shifting from the boy's drawing to the manager's pained expression. She understood immediately. She had known this was the likely outcome. She had made a choice, and this was the consequence. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her joints aching from the sudden movement. She gave the boy one last, gentle look, and he, for the first time, met her eyes for a fleeting second before returning to the safety of his drawing. The walk to the manager's office was a walk of shame, but Alara felt no shame. She felt a strange, hollow calm. She was escorted past the silent, staring tables, a pariah being exiled from paradise. In the cramped, sterile office, away from the opulent theater of the dining room, the words were delivered with a quiet, bureaucratic finality. "I'm so sorry," the manager said, avoiding her eyes. "We have to let you go. Your final check will be mailed to you." There was no argument to be made, no defense to be offered. She had broken the cardinal rule. She had become visible. She had reminded the gods that the mortals who served them were real people. She nodded, a single, sharp dip of her chin, and turned to leave. The weight of her new reality hadn't fully landed yet. The immediate loss of income, the terror of how she would pay for her brother's next round of medication, the crushing exhaustion of starting the job hunt all over again. It was all waiting for her, a tidal wave of panic just beyond the horizon of her current shock. She walked through the swinging doors into the chaotic, clattering world of the kitchen, the sounds and smells a world away from the hushed reverence of the dining room. She moved toward the staff lockers, her body feeling heavy, each step an effort. The adrenaline that had propelled her to act was now gone, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. She leaned against the cool metal of her locker, the reality of the situation beginning to seep in. Fired. For an act of kindness. For a moment of human connection. The bitter irony of it was a physical taste in her mouth. She had spent years making herself small, invisible, swallowing her pride and her intellect to survive, and the one time she had allowed her true self to emerge, she had been punished for it. Despair began to creep in at the edges of her resolve, a cold, familiar companion. She thought of her brother, of his smile, of the immense and terrifying responsibility she carried for his well-being. A wave of nausea washed over her. As she gathered her few belongings from the small, cramped locker, a worn paperback, a spare set of comfortable shoes, a framed photo of her and her brother from before the accident, the swinging doors from the dining room opened again. It was the Maitre d' Warren. He was walking with the investor who had been at Alistair's table. They were speaking in low tones, heading for the exit. Lara kept her head down, not wanting to be seen, not wanting any more interaction with that world. But as they passed, she caught a fragment of their conversation, words that would alter the course of her life forever. The investor was shaking his head, a look of disbelief on his face. "I've never seen anything like it," he was saying. That was a masterclass in empathy. Alistair Finch could learn a thing or two from his Waitress. The name struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. Alistair Finch. It wasn't a common name. Her breath caught in her throat, her blood running cold in her veins. She straightened up, her exhaustion vanishing, replaced by a surge of white-hot, electrifying clarity. Finch. Finch Global. The company that had designed, marketed, and aggressively defended the pediatric neurological device that had shattered her brother's life. The company that had buried internal reports, that had paid off inspectors, that had used a phalanx of ruthless lawyers to crush families like hers into accepting insultingly small settlements. And Alistair Finch was its CEO. He was the man who had personally signed off on the project, the architect of her family's ruin, the ghost that had haunted her every waking moment for the past 5 years. This wasn't a random encounter. It wasn't a cruel twist of fate. It was a reckoning. The man who had destroyed her past had just destroyed her present, all without even knowing who she was. A new kind of strength, forged in the fires of long-nursed grief and righteous anger, flooded her body. The despair she had felt moments ago was burned away, replaced by a singular, unshakable purpose. This was not the end. This was the beginning. She was not just a fired waitress anymore. She was a witness. She was the one person who had seen the public face and the private monster in the same evening. The man who projected an image of corporate responsibility and control was, in reality, a cruel, inept father, incapable of basic human empathy. It was a crack in his armor. A small one, but it was there. And she knew, with the certainty of a physicist discovering a new law of the universe, that she was going to use it to tear his entire world down. The fight was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. A cold, calculated, and long overdue justice. She pulled her phone from her locker, her fingers moving with a speed and precision she hadn't felt in years. She scrolled through her contacts, past the numbers for pharmacies and therapists, past the landline for her apartment, until she found a name she hadn't called in a very long time. Professor Julian Albright. He had been her doctoral mentor at the university, a leading mind in corporate ethics and social responsibility, and the man who had once told her she had the most brilliant and compassionate mind he had ever had the privilege to teach. He had been devastated when she'd had to drop out, and they had kept in sporadic touch, but she had always been too ashamed of her circumstances to truly reconnect. Not anymore. The shame was gone, replaced by a warrior's resolve. She pressed the call button, her heart hammering against her ribs not with fear, but with anticipation. He answered on the third ring, his voice warm and familiar, laced with the academic curiosity she remembered so well. "Ilara, what a surprise! Is everything all right?" She took a deep breath, the stale air of the locker room filling her lungs. When she spoke, the voice that emerged was not the timid, deferential voice of a waitress. It was the voice of Ilara Vance, the brilliant researcher, the determined academic, the woman who was about to start a war. "Professor," she said, her tone steady, calm, and lethally serious. "I'm not all right, but I'm about to be. I need your help. I've just been fired by Alistair Finch, and I think I've finally found a way to make him pay for what he did to my family and to all the others." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Professor Albright's voice came back, the warmth replaced by a matching seriousness. "Ilara," he said slowly, "tell me everything." The office of Professor Julian Albright was the antithesis of the Onyx Room, where the restaurant was a cavern of curated emptiness and dark, polished surfaces. This room was a sanctuary of controlled chaos, a testament to a life lived in the pursuit of knowledge. Books were not merely decorations. They were the room's very architecture, stacked in precarious towers that defied gravity, spilling from shelves onto the floor, their spines cracked, and their pages filled with a constellation of handwritten notes. The air smelled not of truffles and old money, but of aging paper, brewing tea, and the faint, metallic scent of the old radiator that hissed a quiet, comforting rhythm in the corner. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through a large, unwashed window, illuminating a world far removed from the cold, calculated ambitions of Alistair Finch. It was here, in this haven of thought, that Ilara Vance began the process of reassembling herself not as a waitress, but as the formidable intellect she had been forced to suppress for so long. Professor Albright listened, his face a study in deep, sorrowful concentration. He did not interrupt, did not offer platitudes or easy reassurances. He simply sat behind his sprawling oak desk, his hands steepled beneath his chin, and absorbed every detail of her story: the humiliation at the restaurant, the chilling revelation of Finch's identity, the raw, 5-year-old wound of her family's tragedy. He was a man who had built his career studying the ethical failings of corporations, but hearing it from Ilara, a student whose brilliance he had personally witnessed, transformed the academic into the personal. He saw the fire behind her eyes, the cold, steady fury that had replaced the quiet desperation he had occasionally heard in her voice over the years. When she finished, a profound silence settled over the room, filled only by the gentle hiss of the radiator. He finally leaned forward, his gaze locking with hers, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a reflection of her own resolve. He was not just a mentor anymore, he was her first ally. He began to speak, his voice calm and methodical, the voice of a strategist mapping out a battlefield. He laid bare the brutal reality of what she was up against. Finch Global was not just a company. It was a fortress, surrounded by moats of legal privilege and defended by an army of the most ruthless corporate lawyers money could buy. They had weathered the initial storm of the medical device scandal years ago, burying evidence, silencing whistleblowers with ironclad non-disclosure agreements, and using their immense resources to outlast and bankrupt the families who had dared to seek justice. To simply reopen the old case would be a futile gesture, a small boat crashing against a granite cliff. They had already built a narrative of corporate responsibility, of isolated incidents and swift corrections. To challenge them on that ground, he explained, would be to fight the war on their terms, a war they had already proven they could win. The path forward, Albright insisted, had to be different. It could not be about a faulty device alone. It had to be about the man. It had to be about Alistair Finch himself. The incident at the restaurant, he explained, was more than just a cruel act. It was a key. It was a public demonstration of Finch's character, a crack in the carefully polished armor of his public persona. The world saw him as a visionary, a philanthropist, a captain of industry. But she, Ilara, had seen him as a father, and in that most fundamental of human roles, he had been a monstrous failure. Their strategy, therefore, must be to connect the public monster with the private one. They had to prove that the same cold, unfeeling cruelty he showed his own son was the exact same cruelty that allowed him to rush a dangerous product to market, devastating countless other children. It was a strategy of character assassination, but one rooted in the deepest, most undeniable truth. Alara felt a shift inside her, a reawakening of dormant faculties. The years of taking orders, of smiling placidly while her mind raced with financial anxieties, had created a kind of intellectual atrophy. But now, listening to Albright, she felt the old neural pathways firing back to life. The researcher, the analyst, the critical thinker, they were all coming back online. She was no longer just a grieving sister seeking vengeance. She was the lead investigator in the most important case of her life. Her intimate knowledge of her brother's condition, once a source of private pain, was now a unique and powerful lens through which she could analyze Finch's actions. Her academic background in developmental psychology was not a relic of a lost life. It was her primary weapon. She understood the nuances of Leo's meltdown and Alistair's catastrophic response in a way no lawyer or journalist ever could. She was the one person who could translate that moment of private cruelty into a public indictment. The hunt began not in a courtroom but in the quiet, dusty archives of the university library and the glowing, infinite corridors of the internet. Alara spent days, then weeks, immersed in a world of digital ghosts and paper trails. She surrounded herself with a fortress of data, 10 years of Finch Global's SEC filings, shareholder reports, press releases, and archived news articles. She waded through mountains of legal documents from the original lawsuits, her own family's case among them, the dense, obfuscating language, a fresh insult to the raw memory of their suffering. It was grueling, soul-crushing work. For every promising lead, there were a dozen dead ends, 100 redacted pages, 1,000 instances of corporate doublespeak designed to say everything and nothing at once. The exhaustion was immense, a physical weight that settled deep in her bones, but it was different from the weariness of her waitressing job. This was the exhaustion of purpose. During the long, silent nights, surrounded by the glow of a monitor and the smell of stale coffee, the image of her brother was a constant, unwavering presence. She saw his face in the columns of financial data, his struggle in the cold, clinical descriptions of the device's quote, adverse outcomes. This was not an abstract quest for justice. It was a deeply personal mission to reclaim his story from the sanitized footnotes of a corporate report. The anger she felt was a clean, pure fuel. It burned away the fatigue, sharpened her focus, and allowed her to see patterns where others would only see noise. She began to cross-reference timelines, to map out the company's internal communications against its public statements, creating a complex web of deceit. She was no longer just reading the story of Finch Global's corruption. She was deconstructing it, piece by painstaking piece, searching for the one loose thread that could unravel it all. The breakthrough came late one night, in the pale, pre-dawn hours. She was combing through old employee departure announcements, a tedious task she had almost abandoned multiple times. But then she saw it. It wasn't a single name, but a cluster. In the 6 months leading up to the final FDA approval and market launch of the pediatric device, 4 senior engineers and 2 product safety officers had all resigned from Finch Global, all citing vague, personal reasons or new opportunities. It was a statistical anomaly, a sudden, inexplicable exodus of the very people who would have been most intimately involved with the device's final testing and rollout. In the cold, quiet library, her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was not a coincidence. This was an evacuation. These people had seen something, they had known something, and they had jumped from a sinking ship just before it set sail. Professor Albright confirmed her suspicions. Such a concentrated departure of key personnel was a massive red flag, the kind of internal crisis that companies like Finch Global would move heaven and earth to conceal. He activated his own network, a web of former students, fellow academics, and industry contacts he had cultivated over a 30-year career. The task was daunting, These were ghosts. They had signed impenetrable non-disclosure agreements, their severance packages contingent on absolute and eternal silence. Their professional lives after Finch Global were deliberately low profile. Finding them would be like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a vast, windswept beach. The search became a frustrating exercise in chasing shadows. Old addresses led to empty lots, phone numbers were disconnected, and online profiles were scrubbed clean of any mention of their time at the company. For weeks it seemed like another dead end. The frustration was a bitter pill, the feeling of being so close to a tangible truth only to have it dissolve into mist. Ilara felt the tendrils of her old despair begin to creep back in. What if the fortress was simply too well built? What if the ghosts were determined to stay buried? But Albright was relentless. His academic tenacity, a powerful anchor for her wavering hope. He spent hours making quiet, careful phone calls, speaking in hypotheticals, calling in old favors, until finally he got a hit. A former student, now working in tech recruitment, had a 10-year-old file on one of the engineers, a man named Marcus Thorne. He hadn't placed him in a job, but he had his last known location, a small, sleepy town in rural Vermont, a world away from the high-stakes tech corridor he had once inhabited. The name Marcus Thorne became an obsession. Ilara dedicated herself to learning everything she could about this man. He had been a rising star at Finch Global, a brilliant mechanical engineer with a reputation for meticulousness. Then, suddenly, he had vanished from the industry. He now ran a small independent bookstore in Vermont, a life so radically different from his past that it was clearly a deliberate retreat. There was no social media presence, no professional footprint, just the quiet existence of a man trying to disappear. The first contact had to be perfect. A threatening legal letter would send him deeper into hiding. A direct phone call would be too easily dismissed. So Ilara chose her own weapon, empathy. She wrote him an email, a carefully crafted message that was not an accusation, but a plea. She didn't mention lawsuits or justice. She told him about her brother. She described, in simple, unadorned language, what it was like to watch a bright, vibrant child's future be stolen from him. She wrote about the hum of the machines that filled her small apartment, the daily regimen of therapies, the small, heartbreaking moments when he would struggle to communicate a simple need. She didn't blame Marcus. She didn't even mention his work on the device. She simply told him that she knew he was one of the few people in the world who understood the true story of what had happened inside that company, and that her family and countless others were still living with the consequences of that story every single day. She ended the email with a single, direct question. I just want to understand how this could have happened. Can you help me understand? She sent the email, and then she waited, the silence that followed stretching for 3 agonizing days. The reply, when it came, was short and terse. 3 words. I can't help. It was a slammed door, a wall of fear. But Ilara saw something else in the brevity of his response. It wasn't the dismissive reply of a man with a clear conscience. It was the terrified response of a man who was still running. So she wrote back, just once more. I understand you are afraid, she wrote. I have been afraid every day for the last 5 years. But my brother doesn't have the option of running away from what this device did to him. I am not asking you to be a hero. I am just asking you to be a witness to the truth. I will be at the Black Bear Diner, off Route 7 in your town, this Saturday at noon. I hope you'll be there. It was a gamble, a final desperate play that put all her hopes on the conscience of a complete stranger. The Black Bear Diner was a world frozen in time, a place of cracked red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and the lingering smell of bacon and old coffee. It was the perfect anonymous setting, a liminal space where secrets could be shared without fear of being overheard. Ilara sat in a booth by the window, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in her hands, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every time the bell above the door jingled, her head would snap up, a jolt of nervous energy coursing through her. Noon came and went, then 12:15. The cold dread of failure began to settle in her stomach. She had been foolish to think a man could be coaxed out of a decade of hiding by a stranger's email. She was about to leave when the bell jingled one last time, and a man stood silhouetted in the doorway, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with a weariness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. It was Marcus Thorne. He slid into the booth opposite her, avoiding her eyes, his hands trembling as he picked up a menu he had no intention of reading. He looked older than his years, a man haunted by a ghost of his own making. He spoke first, his voice low and raspy, as if it hadn't been used for a real conversation in a long time. He told her about the pressure, the impossible deadlines handed down from the executive suite. He talked about Alistair Finch as a force of nature, a man who did not tolerate delays, questions, or bad news. Profit projections were treated as gospel, and any data that contradicted them was considered an act of corporate treason. Marcus and his team had known there were problems with the device's neural interface. The simulations were showing micro-fluctuations, unpredictable energy spikes. That, in a developing brain, could be catastrophic. They needed another 6 months, maybe a year, to fix it. He told her he had done what any ethical engineer would do. He had documented his findings. He had written a detailed 12-page memorandum, complete with the damning simulation data, outlining the precise nature of the risk. He had bypassed his direct supervisor and sent it straight to the top, directly to Alistair Finch's office. He called it the Damocles Memo, because he knew it was a sword hanging over the entire project. He had naively believed that the data would speak for itself, that the company would have no choice but to delay the launch and fix the fatal flaw. He had been wrong. The memo was not just ignored, it was actively buried. He was called into a meeting, not with the R&D department, but with Finch's legal team. He was praised for his diligence, then offered a promotion and a transfer to a different division, a golden muzzle, to ensure his silence. When Marcus refused the transfer, the tone changed. The lawyers presented him with a non-disclosure agreement of such breathtaking scope and menace that it was essentially a contract of indentured silence. It came with a severance package that was generous enough to be a bribe, and a clear, unspoken threat of personal and professional ruin if he ever violated its terms. He saw his colleagues, the other engineers who had voiced concerns, take the deal one by one, their careers and families held hostage. He was the last one to hold out, but in the end, the pressure was too immense. He signed the papers, took the money, and walked away, not just from Finch Global, but from his entire life, consumed by a guilt that had been eating him alive for 10 years. He had tried to convince himself that he was powerless, that he had done all he could, but her email, her story, had shattered that carefully constructed illusion. Ilara listened, her own anger mingling with a profound sense of sorrow for this broken man. He was not a villain. He was another one of Finch's victims, trapped in a different kind of prison. When he finished his story, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his confession, she finally asked the question upon which everything hinged. "The memo?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The Damocles Memo. Do you still have a copy?" Marcus let out a long, shuddering breath and nodded. He told her that on his last day, in a final act of defiance, he had copied his entire project folder onto a small, encrypted, external hard drive. He had kept it all these years, a piece of digital penance, hidden away in a safe deposit box, never knowing if he would ever have the courage to use it. It was the smoking gun. It was the irrefutable link between the device's fatal flaw and Alistair Finch's personal knowledge of it. He slid a small, folded piece of paper across the sticky tabletop. On it was a string of alphanumeric characters, a password. He told her the location of the bank and the number of the safe deposit box. He was giving it all to her. It was an act of profound trust, of placing his entire future in her hands. "I can't be the one to bring it forward," he whispered, his eyes finally meeting hers, filled with a mixture of terror and relief. "They will destroy me, but you, You have nothing left to lose. He's already taken everything from you. In that moment, Alara knew she had what she needed. The drive was more than just evidence. It was the voice of every engineer who had been silenced, every parent who had been ignored, every child who had been harmed. It was the truth, codified and preserved, waiting for its moment to be heard. While Alara was unearthing the past, Alistair Finch was busy trying to pave over it with a veneer of philanthropy. He was not a man who believed in coincidence, and the sudden, quiet departure of a major investor from the deal discussed at the Onyx Room, citing vague concerns about leadership character, had set off alarm bells in his meticulously ordered world. His internal security team, a group of former intelligence operatives, had also flagged a series of low-level digital inquiries into long-dormant personnel files, specifically those of the engineers who had left before the device launch. He didn't know the source of the threat, didn't know who was digging, but he could feel the subtle tremors of a distant earthquake. His entire empire was built on the bedrock of his flawless public image, and he would not allow cracks to form. His response was not one of introspection or fear, but of overwhelming force. He instructed his legal department to proactively re-engage with every former employee connected to the old project, reminding them, in no uncertain terms, of the lifelong consequences of violating their non-disclosure agreements. He deployed private investigators to monitor Marcus Thorne and the others, convinced that one of them was the source of the leak, a disgruntled former employee looking for a payday. His arrogance blinded him to the true nature of the threat. He was looking for a familiar enemy, a corporate rival, a greedy opportunist. He was utterly incapable of conceiving that the catalyst for his potential downfall was the invisible waitress he had dismissed with a flick of his wrist, a woman whose name he never even bothered to learn. To counteract any potential negative press, Alistair accelerated his most ambitious public relations initiative to date, the Finch Global Children's Health Gala. It was to be the philanthropic event of the season, a lavish affair held at the city's most prestigious museum, raising money for the very children's hospital his company had once endangered. He would be the keynote speaker, delivering a carefully crafted speech about corporate responsibility, compassion, and his unwavering commitment to pediatric health. It was a masterpiece of cynical image laundering, a way to inoculate himself against any future accusations by positioning himself as a champion of children. He was building a firewall of public goodwill, confident that no spark of scandal could ever breach it. He was, in essence, setting the stage for his own execution, believing he was building a throne. Back in Professor Albright's office, the atmosphere had transformed from one of academic inquiry to that of a strategic command center. The encrypted hard drive sat on the desk between Alara and Albright like an unexploded bomb. After a tense, nerve-wracking process, they had successfully decrypted it. The Damocles memo was there, just as Marcus had described. Its cold, technical language, a chilling prophecy of the tragedy that had befallen her brother and so many others. More damning still were the email chains attached to it, showing the memo being received, acknowledged, and then deliberately buried by Finch's executive assistants and legal team. It was the irrefutable proof of a conscious, calculated decision to place profits over the lives of children, a decision that led directly to Alistair Finch himself. They knew a lawsuit was not the answer. Finch's lawyers would bury them in motions, delays, and appeals, bleeding them dry long before the memo ever saw the light of a courtroom. They needed a different kind of weapon, a different kind of battlefield. The justice they sought had to be swift, public, and undeniable. As they debated their next move, a new player entered the game. Professor Albright made one last call, this time to Sarah Jenkins, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist known for her tenacity and her refusal to be intimidated by corporate power. She was the validator, the one person who could take their story and broadcast it to the world with unimpeachable credibility. The final plan was forged in that cluttered office, a perfect convergence of their unique skills. Sarah Jenkins, with her media credentials and insider contacts, would secure Alara a place on the program at the Finch Global Gala. She wouldn't be listed as an accuser, but but as a, quote, special guest, a former academic with a personal story about the importance of ethical medical innovation. Professor Albright, the master of rhetoric, would help Alara craft her speech, a narrative that would begin with quiet dignity and build to a devastating fact-based crescendo. And Alara, the once invisible waitress, would be the one to deliver the blow. She would stand on Alistair Finch's own stage, in front of his hand-picked audience of the rich and powerful, and she would use the truth as a weapon. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not be fought with lawyers or money, but with the simple, undeniable power of a story that had been suppressed for far too long. Alara looked at the small, framed photo of her brother that she now carried with her everywhere. The hollow ache of grief that had been her constant companion for 5 years was still there, but it was now mingled with something new, a cold, clear, and unshakable sense of purpose. The waitress was gone, the victim was gone. In her place was a woman who had found her voice, a woman who understood that true power was not the ability to command and dismiss, but the courage to stand up and speak the truth, no matter the cost. The checkmate was not just a possibility, it was an inevitability. Alistair Finch had built a grand theater to celebrate himself, and Alara Vance was about to burn it to the ground. The Great Hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art had been transformed into a temple for the modern age, a shrine dedicated to the worship of wealth and carefully curated compassion. Towering floral arrangements composed of orchids and lilies so white they seemed to glow reached toward the vaulted ceilings, their scent a sweet, cloying perfume that mingled with the expensive fragrances worn by the guests. The lighting was a soft, golden wash, designed to make diamonds sparkle and skin look flawless, casting the attendees in the reverent glow of old masters' paintings. Alistair Finch stood at a grand podium, bathed in the warmth of a single, brilliant spotlight, a conquering hero returning from a victorious campaign. The applause that cascaded around him was thunderous, a wave of validation from the city's elite. He had just delivered a masterful speech, a symphony of corporate responsibility and heartfelt concern, pledging millions to the new pediatric wing of the city hospital. He felt invincible, his public image not merely restored but elevated to that of a secular saint. The whispers of doubt that had followed the incident at the Onyx Room had been definitively silenced, buried under an avalanche of philanthropy and public adoration. He allowed a humble, benevolent smile to grace his lips, absorbing the adulation like a dying star absorbing a planet, convinced he had just cemented his legacy for all time. The MC for the evening, the formidable journalist Sarah Jenkins, stepped back to the podium as the applause finally subsided. Her expression was professionally neutral, giving no hint of the earthquake she was about to trigger. She spoke into the microphone, her voice calm and measured. "And now," she announced, "we have a special guest to share a personal perspective on the vital importance of ethical innovation in medicine. Please welcome Ms. Alara Vance." The name meant nothing to the assembled crowd. It meant nothing to Alistair, who had already turned from the podium and was accepting the handshakes and backpats of his peers in the front row. He glanced toward the stage with a look of mild, dismissive curiosity, expecting a tearful parent or a grateful patient who would serve as the emotional capstone to his triumphant evening. Alara emerged from the wings, a solitary figure moving into the brilliant spotlight. She was not the ghost in the black uniform he vaguely remembered. She was dressed in a simple, dark blue dress, elegant in its understated severity. Her hair was pulled back, her face devoid of elaborate makeup, her entire presence a stark contrast to the gilded opulence of her surroundings. Her heart was a steady, powerful drum against her ribs, a war drum sounding the charge. In her mind's eye, she saw not the 1,000 faces in the audience, but one, her brother's, his image a sacred talisman, giving her a strength she never knew she possessed. She walked to the podium, her steps even and deliberate, and looked out at the sea of wealth, her gaze eventually finding and locking onto the man in the front row who still had no idea he was a dead man walking. Her voice, when she began to speak, was not loud, but it was imbued with a clarity that cut through the cavernous hall, commanding an immediate and absolute silence. She did not begin with anger or accusations. She began with a story about hope. She spoke of the miracle of modern medicine, the sacred promise that technology makes to the most vulnerable among us. She painted a vivid, emotional picture of a family receiving a difficult diagnosis for their child, and the sliver of light offered by a new device, a new procedure, a new hope for a life of dignity and possibility. She spoke of the immense, almost holy trust that families place in the hands of the companies that design these instruments of healing, a trust that is foundational to our society. The audience was mesmerized, their hearts stirred by the universal tale of struggle and hope. Alistair Finch listened with a detached, self-satisfied air, nodding along sagely, believing this anonymous woman's story was the perfect, emotional seasoning for his own corporate narrative. He saw her as an instrument of his own public relations, a final, poignant note in the symphony of his success, utterly oblivious to the fact that she was not the seasoning, but the poison. The transition was so seamless, so subtle, that at first, no one noticed the ground shifting beneath their feet. But this trust, Alara continued, her voice losing its gentle, narrative quality and taking on the sharp, precise edge of a scalpel, is a fragile thing. When it is broken, it is not just a single family that is shattered, but the very promise of our collective humanity. As she spoke, the massive screen behind her, which had been displaying the shimmering logo of the Finch Global Children's Health Gala, flickered and changed. It now showed a stark black and white image of a document. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, Internal Memorandum. Subject, Project Chimera, Pre-Launch Safety Analysis. A low murmur rippled through the audience, a current of confusion and unease. Alara's voice grew colder, more clinical. She began to quote directly from the text on the screen. Simulation data indicates a statistically significant risk of unpredictable energy spikes at the neural interface. In a developing pediatric brain, the potential for catastrophic, irreversible neurological damage is not just a possibility, it is a probability. I strongly advise a minimum 6-month delay to re-engineer the core regulator. The words hung in the air, sterile, technical, and utterly damning. In the front row, Alistair Finch's blood ran cold. The patronizing smile vanished from his face, replaced by a rigid mask of disbelief. He knew that document. It was a ghost he had buried a decade ago. "My name is Alara Vance," she declared, her voice now ringing with the undeniable force of truth. And the brilliant, meticulous engineer who wrote that memo was ignored. His career threatened until he was forced into silence. The device was not delayed. It was rushed to market, its launch timed to maximize third-quarter profits. And one of the first children it was used on, one of the first lives it was supposed to save, was my brother. The screen changed again. The cold, technical document was replaced by a photograph of a beautiful, laughing boy with bright, intelligent eyes, frozen in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Then, with a gut-wrenching finality, a third image appeared beside it. The same boy, 5 years later, slumped in a highly specialized wheelchair, his gaze distant, the light in his eyes extinguished, a web of tubes and wires connecting him to the machines that kept him alive. A collective, audible gasp swept through the hall, a sound of shared horror. For the first time, Alara's voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the sheer volcanic force of her long-suppressed grief and rage. For 5 years, my family has lived with the consequences of that decision. We have lived in the wreckage that Finch Global and its CEO created for the sake of a stock price. And then, she did it. She lifted her head, her eyes burning with a righteous fire, and pointed a single, steady finger directly at the man in the front row. She looked straight into the eyes of Alistair Finch. And in that instant, the billionaire finally saw her. The recognition dawned, a slow, sickening wave of comprehension. The waitress, the boy, the napkin, the humiliation. It all crashed together in his mind, a kaleidoscope of horror. He was not just seeing a woman. He He was seeing the face of his own judgment. "The man who stands before you tonight," Ilara's voice boomed, amplified by the microphone, echoing off the marble walls, asking for your donations to heal children, is the very same man who knowingly, consciously destroyed mine. He wrapped himself in the flag of philanthropy to hide the blood on his hands. He speaks of compassion, but his soul is a barren wasteland of greed. I know this because I have seen it. I have seen the cold, unfeeling cruelty he reserves not just for the children his company harms, but for his own son. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place, creating a picture of such monstrous hypocrisy that the audience recoiled as if from a physical blow. A few months ago, she concluded, her voice dropping to a low, devastating whisper that was somehow louder than any shout, "I saw his son suffering, and I offered him a moment of quiet, human kindness." And for that act, this great philanthropist, this champion of children, had me fired from my job as a waitress so he would not have to be reminded of his own failure as a father. The dam of civility broke. The hall erupted into a cacophony of shouts and camera flashes. It was a feeding frenzy. Alistair Finch stood as if turned to stone, his face a ghastly white, his carefully constructed world dissolving into chaos around him. The spotlight that had been his coronation was now an interrogation lamp, pinning him in its merciless glare. He opened his mouth, a silent scream forming on his lips, but he was drowned out by the roar of his own undoing. He was no longer a titan, a king, a god. He was just a man, exposed, undone, and utterly, irrevocably finished. The aftermath was not a slow decline, it was a free fall. As Ilara spoke her final words, Sarah Jenkins's investigative report, complete with a downloadable copy of the entire Damocles memo and Marcus Thorne's now protected testimony, went live online. 1,000 smartphones lit up the darkened hall, and the story spread across the globe with the speed of a digital wildfire. News alerts buzzed in every pocket. Finch Global's stock ticker, displayed on a financial news channel on a monitor in the lobby, became a cascading waterfall of red. Alistair was swarmed, not by admirers, but by a frantic security detail trying to shepherd him through a gauntlet of flashing cameras and shouted questions. His face was a mask of vacant horror, the face of a man watching his entire life burn to the ground in a single, all-consuming inferno. Before his car had even pulled away from the museum, the first statement from Finch Global's board of directors was released, announcing his immediate suspension and an internal investigation. By morning, the Department of Justice had officially reopened the criminal case. His name, once a synonym for success, became a byword for the most cynical form of corporate evil. His downfall was not just financial or legal, it was absolute. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Ilara Vance finally exposed the truth. Months later, the world looked different. The name Alistair Finch was now a relic, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Ilara Vance, however, was just beginning. She stood, not in a museum or a restaurant, but in a bright, sun-drenched office that overlooked the city. She was the newly appointed director of the Vance Foundation for Corporate Accountability, an organization established and funded by a consortium of ethical technology firms, moved to action by her story. Her work was no longer about survival, it was about empowerment. She now wielded the resources, the legal team, and the public platform to fight for other families who had been silenced and broken by corporate greed. Her days were filled with strategy meetings, press conferences, and quiet, determined work. But this afternoon was different. She was not in her office. She was on the floor of a state-of-the-art sensory therapy room, a space she had designed herself. Across from her sat a young girl, her hands flapping in distress. Ilara did not speak. She simply took out a piece of paper and a pen, and with a steady, knowing hand, she began to draw a simple, repetitive pattern. The girl's frantic movements slowly subsided, her eyes drawn to the silent, steady rhythm of the pen. In the corner of the room, her brother sat in his new, highly advanced wheelchair, a tablet in his lap. He looked over at his sister, and for the first time in a very long time, a genuine, brilliant smile spread across his face. Ilara had not just won a war. She had reclaimed a future, transforming the deepest pain of her life into a beacon of hope for countless others, proving that the quietest voice, when armed with the truth, can be the most powerful force on earth. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.